I should have said at the outset that if anybody has questions, please put them in the chat. And as we go along, I will ask them. Feel free, but I'll save some of them until the end, and I'll sprinkle them in as well. So Peter, you use some people who are very familiar to me as a business and economic journalist, people like Jamie Dimon, Mark Benioff, Larry Fink, Steve Schwartzman, Bezos, as your primary examples of Davos Man, your metaphorical Davos Man. I wonder if what you think about the idea that you're basically making them scapegoats, that they obviously benefited quite well from the system in which they operate. Some of them, like Bezos, really had nothing to do with things like Ronald Reagan tax cuts or a lot of the things that happened during the Great Recession, the bailouts and the bank collapses and so forth. Mark Benioff is a fairly new person on the scene. And Jamie Dimon runs, a large bank that isn't really seen as one of the primary instigators of the financial crisis. In fact, he kind of helped out the Treasury by buying some of the failing banks. And I
mean, that's what he says.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you say to this idea that you're using them as scapegoats and that they're not really the cause of all these things? They just happen to be able to work within the system in which we all have to work within.
Well, I love that question because I think that's flatly wrong, but I also think it's emblematic of how we tend to attack stories in our journalism. We tend to speak in this kind of passive voice and ascribe belief as if we're always having policy disagreements and reasonable. We somehow have different camps on the question of tax cuts for wealthy people. Like it's a perfectly reasonable proposition to argue, as Jamie Dimon did when he was running the Business Roundtable, an organization that was a leading architect of the Trump tax cuts that were worth about $1.5 trillion, with most of the benefits landing just, I guess, accidentally into the pockets of people like Jamie Dimon and Mark Benioff and Steve Schwartzman and Jeff Bezos. The whole point of my book is to argue that what we've experienced over the last half century is not by accident. It's not some sort of puppeteer conspiracy. And it would be ridiculous to say that all of our problems are the result of these 5 people or even the thousands of billionaires around the world. But the sort of dark matter in the equation by which huge numbers of middle-class people have lost their economic security, not just in the United States, but in most major developed economies, is inequality. And, to argue that Bezos was just some sort of, lucky beneficiary of his times. I mean, this is a company that employs 100+ lobbyists in Washington, D.C. This is a company that has lobbied for years against paid sick leave. And then somehow in the first wave of the pandemic, you have huge numbers of warehouse workers laboring in Amazon facilities who Bezos calls essential workers. They don't have any protective care. Though Amazon seems to be able to give them protective care that they can put into boxes to send to other people who are paying for it. And when some of those workers protest and say, well, hold on, we'd like to know a little more about the extent of COVID and why we don't have any protection. And by the way, we're all the managers who used to work in the facilities, but are now somehow just off having Zoom meetings. The leader of the protest movement at a big warehouse in Staten Island is fired and accused of violating quarantine. Which is really ironic given that he wants everyone to be quarantined. I use Bezos as an example of a great beneficiary of globalization, which has been hugely beneficial to the American economy writ large. But he, as part of the billionaire class, has applied lobbying muscle to making sure that he and his people capture most of the bounty, while not enough flows to the people who work for him. And then, of course, the punchline is he flies himself off into space in the middle of the pandemic to the tune of $5.5 billion and actually thanks his warehouse workers. It's not just that Jeff Bezos is doing really well while his warehouse workers are not doing so well. It's that Jeff Bezos is doing really well because his warehouse workers are not doing well. His whole model is predicated under the assumption that there will be huge numbers of people desperate enough for a job that they will work in unsafe conditions, and given the choice between their own health and their paychecks, they'll choose their paychecks every time. I mean, Jamie Dimon, just sort of accidentally becomes the head of America's largest bank, which accidentally takes control of failing banks and ends up 10 years after the great financial crisis with just a monumental share of American banking assets, double pre-crisis. Now, I mean, is this just lucky happenstance? I mean, we've had a system where the billionaires have functioned as their own social network. I mean, we know that people like Larry Fink, who's the world's largest asset manager, who now is the founder of BlackRock. He's another one of my 5 primary characters, who controls $10 trillion of assets around the globe. He had extraordinary access to Hank Paulson, who was the Treasury Secretary in the George W. Bush administration at the time that the great financial crisis rescues were being crafted. And he had even greater access to the Trump administration and Mnuchin during the time of the pandemic rescues that time and again are focused on bailing out the asset class. And it's not an accident that the asset class gets bailed out above and beyond anybody else. Now, we've broken from that pattern to a degree in the most recent pandemic bailouts, especially under Biden. But I just pushed back, heartily against this idea that, yeah, these guys were just standing there and somehow all this money fell into their pocket. I mean, Benioff, who is the most complex of my 5 characters, his philanthropy is pretty extensive. He's organized his company around, contributing 1% of revenues and 1% of employee time to philanthropic endeavors. He does seem to take stands on issues like, when the state of Indiana threatens a law that's going to discriminate against LGBTQ employees, he threatens to pull investment out. He takes on Twitter and Google over data. But this is a guy who not once, but twice has managed to pay the modest sum of 0 in federal taxes on billions of dollars in revenue. Again, he didn't create that system, you could argue. He inherited it from the Clinton administration, which made it possible to stick your intellectual property in Ireland and then make your revenues in the US turn into losses. But he exploited it, and he's a member of the Business Roundtable himself and the US Chamber of Commerce. These are the lobby shops that are serving their constituents, and those constituents are the billionaires.